But let's talk about the prevailing, I guess, myth that has been created around World War II, and maybe we'll get into those 6 main elements of that myth.
Sure. So, as you suggest, Spielberg and Brokaw and Stephen Ambrose, the architects of what we might call the 50th anniversary mythology of the war. And I think that's the most, there have been many myths of World War II, but I think that's the most powerful one. And the tenets that I suggest in the book are as follows: that the United States went to war to liberate the world from fascism and tyranny, which was, of course, a consequence of the war, but not necessarily the motivation for joining it. That all Americans were absolutely united in their commitment to the war effort. And that tenet, I think, gained a lot of traction after subsequent wars, which had nothing like the same consensus. And so there was a certain nostalgia for an earlier war in which at least most people seemed to be in agreement. The third is that everyone on the home front made tremendous sacrifices. The fourth, that Americans are liberators who fight decently and only when they must. The fifth, that World War II was a foreign tragedy with a happy American ending. And then the last, and these tenets are modeled on George Orwell's maxims for the writer in his essay, Politics in the English Language, that everyone has always agreed on points 1 through 5. And I suggest that deep down, we know that these myths aren't necessarily true, but they have become reflexive, and we invoke them all the time, especially when we confront all of the other wars that have followed in the wake of World War II.
So let's I want to take each one and dig into them a little deeper, and then, but let's start, like, when did they all form simultaneously, or I guess did these myths all sort of like grow concurrently, I guess, over the years, or were they sort of like sequentially deployed?
I think that they grew by fits and starts. There isn't necessarily a sequence to them, but at certain points in our history, they were more prevalent than others. And as I said, they arose mostly later, although not all of them. The first one, I would say, the idea of why we went to war, began before we stopped fighting. So where one can see the transformation, we can see it in a lot of different places, but where you can see it very clearly is in some of the products the government made for American service members. So there were these little guides, pocket guides to the various countries in which service members found themselves. And you can very clearly see in the guide to Germany, for example, which has a section that tells service members why they're fighting in Germany, which had to sort of combat some of the kind of natural allegiances, I think, that Americans felt, or at least they didn't feel that Germans were necessarily an enemy. And so these books sort of explained why. And they explained the roots of fascism. And they also recast America's role in the 30s, which is, of course, an isolationist one. But they recast it as this threat that America had recognized all along. And so then you begin to see the way that it changes, and we sort of backdate our participation. We backdate our interest in world affairs, and we backdate our recognition of the very real dangers of fascism, which were that recognition came quite late, I think.
And part of that is, like, I would imagine fits quite well into the erasure of Soviet Union participation in the fight, right? Where there's very little understanding, I think, domestically about how many millions of Soviet soldiers died in World War II. And I mean, I would imagine that part of that rewriting of history fits in well with the Cold War that begins after the war.
I think the role of the Russians, the role of the Soviet Union was extremely difficult, especially to explain to American service members. So first, the Soviet Union was allied with Germany, then allied with us, and then after the war in the Cold War, the enemy again. And so I think that became a particularly difficult, thorny problem. And parts of this myth did succeed in erasing that as well.
What's fascinating is the idea that they have to hand out pamphlets as to why you're fighting here sort of undercuts the idea that everybody understood why they were fighting there.
And I think it's unrealistic to expect that everyone in an army understands all of the philosophical or political commitments animating any conflict. Many are concerned quite rightly with short-term survival. But it was certainly true that for the French, which tried to explain why the French were our allies and tried to overcome a kind of natural distaste, it would appear, between the Americans and the French, explaining the role of Lafayette, explaining the role of the French in the American Revolution, and that the French were, like us, lovers of liberty, was something that these books, particularly as toward the end of the war and afterwards, as we occupied France and became increasingly the tensions between Americans and French, as has been documented by many historians, became increasingly intense.
We're going to talk obviously more about this, and I want to keep going through this list. But it seems to me that these myths are propagated by the U.S. government, and then there are entities in our society that find it, for whatever reason, that like it's just much easier to ride these myths that have already been initiated. I mean, the myths are established, right, by the U.S. government to get the military, to get people in the military to do their job. And I mean, I'm struck by the idea of like how it's almost the opposite of what happened in the context of Iraq. And it may be the opposite in other military interventions, but this one I was, an adult. Like, we knew why we were going into Iraq, even though, I mean, supposedly on day one, which was, we got to fight them over there before we fight them over here, and we don't want the firing gun or whatever it is to be a smokestack, a nuclear, mushroom cloud, and then all of that seemed to unravel as we got there, which is sort of the opposite, it feels like, in terms of World War II. But let's head to number two, that we were all united in this fight.
Well, I would say that this number two, and really the entire myth, you said that they're propagated by the government. I think myth works in slightly more mysterious ways than that, and in some kinds of insidious ways. So I don't think they're all sort of part of an official propaganda campaign. I think they are certainly encouraged. The rhetoric of that war was used to justify later wars, I think, certainly. But I think that this tenet as well, in the terms of people being absolutely united, arose in the wake of wars in which Americans were emphatically not united. So Vietnam, perhaps the most obvious case. But I think that a lot of the discussion of everyone being welcomed home with open arms became a sort of nostalgic glance for Americans who did not necessarily welcome Vietnam veterans home, and did not embrace them, and confused perhaps the war with those who fought it, which is something I think we've tried to atone for yet again in these conflicts. But I do think that if you look at the films and the books of the time, and you look at the newspapers of the time and other documentation, you'll see that those soldiers, there were so many of them, millions returning, were a source of great anxiety rather than people we welcomed home with great enthusiasm. Although, of course, I think the enthusiasm was certainly greater than in later wars.
But didn't, I guess what I'm saying about the government propaganda, like I can just Google, United World War II, and I'm imagining we would have, I don't know how many posters that would say, we're united, and that, the government generates these, I guess, memes, for lack of a better term. I don't think that's what they would call them at that time. And they're picked up because they maybe, I don't know, follow some romanticized version, and they become easier for Spielberg. We'll get into Spielberg a little bit in a bit, but I mean, he he liked big ideas like that. After his first movie bombed, everything after that was going to be sort of broad and accessible. And what's more accessible than essentially, you know, getting a theme from a war poster?
And I think, well, I think cries for unity, for rallying around various symbols and ideas is part and parcel of any nation going to war. Absolutely. I do think also that in the case of this war, and this is part of the power of the myth, it offers us the most flattering version of ourselves. That's why it's so seductive. That's why I think it makes such good movies. And that's why I think the mythology of the 50th anniversary celebrations of the war were so powerful. And part of my point is that it celebrating the war in the way we do, I think, condemns us to looking backwards rather than forwards. And we keep sort of searching for a war that will have the same kinds of effects, the same kinds of consequences.